Tonight, we will journey together, slowly and gently, into the everyday world of one of the greatest civilizations that has ever existed, ancient Egypt. But we will not be following pharaohs into battle or gods through the underworld. Instead, we will do something quieter and perhaps more soothing still. We will slip into the ordinary, daily life of the people who lived along the River Nile thousands of years ago and see how they woke and worked and ate and loved and rested in a world at once utterly different from our own and in its small human details very much the same. This is a long and gentle journey, far longer than a single night's rest, and you do not need to hold on to any of it. Let it drift over you like warm sunlight on the surface of a slow river. There is nowhere you need to be tonight, and nothing you need to remember. And if you find comfort in these quiet journeys into the past, you are warmly welcome to follow along or to subscribe and to leave a gentle like before you drift away, so that these stories can keep finding the people who need them. So settle in, make yourself comfortable, and let us travel back across thousands of years to a green ribbon of life winding through a vast and golden desert. To understand daily life in ancient Egypt, we must first understand the river, for everything, absolutely everything, depended upon it. Egypt is, in truth, a land of desert, a vast expanse of sand and rock and burning sun, where almost no rain ever falls. And yet, through the heart of this desert flows one of the greatest rivers on earth, the Nile, running from the far south all the way to the sea. And along its banks, and only along its banks, life could flourish. The ancient Greek historian Herodotus called Egypt the gift of the Nile, and never was a truer thing said. For without the river, there would have been no Egypt at all, only empty desert. But with it, there arose one of the richest and most enduring civilizations the world has ever known, sustained year after year, century after century, for thousands of years, by the steady, life-giving flow of that single, extraordinary river. The Egyptians themselves saw their land as divided into two parts, and they gave them two names based upon their colors. There was the black land, the Kemet, the narrow strip of dark, rich soil along the banks of the Nile, made fertile by the river, where the people lived and farmed. And there was the red land, the Desert, the vast and barren desert beyond, the realm of danger and death and chaos, where almost nothing could live. Between these two worlds, the black and the red, the whole of Egyptian life was lived. The strip of black land was astonishingly narrow. In many places, a person could walk from the green fields to the edge of the desert in a matter of minutes, from a world of teeming life to a world of utter desolation in a few short steps. All of Egypt's millions lived crowded together upon this thin green ribbon, and the desert on either side served as a great wall, protecting them from invaders and giving their civilization the peace and the stability to endure for age upon age. The great gift of the Nile came each year in the form of a miracle, one upon which the entire life of Egypt turned: the annual flood, the inundation. Every summer, far to the south, in lands the Egyptians never saw, great rains fell, and the river swelled and rose, and came flooding down into Egypt, spilling over its banks, and covering the whole of the black land beneath its waters for weeks at a time. To us, a river flooding the fields each year might sound like a disaster, but for the Egyptians, it was the very source of their life and their wealth. For when the floodwaters at last drew back, they left behind a fresh layer of rich, dark, fertile mud spread across the fields, renewing the soil year after year, so that the land never wore out but remained forever fruitful. It was this yearly gift of black mud that made Egyptian farming so bountiful and Egypt itself so rich. And so the whole rhythm of Egyptian life was governed by the river and by the great cycle of the flood. The Egyptians divided their year not into 4 seasons as we do, but into 3, each tied to the river and the work of the land. There was the season of the flood, when the waters covered the fields, the season of growing, when the crops were planted and tended in the fresh mud, and the season of harvest, when the ripened grain was gathered in before the flood returned. The first season, the season of the inundation, ran through the summer and early autumn, when the river rose and covered the land. During these weeks, there could be no farming, for the fields lay beneath the water. It was a time of waiting and of rest from the labor of the land, but it was not a time of idleness, for it was during the flood, when the farmers could not farm, that many of them went to labor on the great building projects of the Pharaoh, and it was in these months, some believe, that much of the work upon the great pyramids and temples was done. As the waters receded, the second season began, the season of growing through the cooler months of winter. Now the farmers went out onto the fresh, wet, fertile mud, and the work of planting began. They scattered their seed and drove their animals across the fields to tread it into the soft ground, and then waited and tended and watered as the green shoots rose and the crops ripened under the mild Egyptian sun. And then came the third season, the season of the harvest, in the spring, before the heat of summer and the return of the flood. Now the fields, once bare mud, stood golden with ripened grain, and the whole population turned out to gather it in. It was the busiest and most vital time of the year, a race to bring in the harvest that would feed the land for the months to come. And upon its success or failure hung the prosperity, and sometimes the very survival, of all Egypt. Let us picture that harvest, for it is a scene repeated in its essence across thousands of years. The men move through the golden fields, cutting the grain with sickles of wood set with sharp flint or bronze teeth. Behind them, others gather the cut stalks into sheaves and load them onto donkeys or carry them in baskets. The grain is brought to the threshing floor, where cattle are driven round and round over it to separate the precious kernels from the straw. And then it is tossed into the air, so that the wind carries away the chaff, and the heavy grain falls back to the ground, ready to be gathered and stored. The chief crops of Egypt were the grains, emmer wheat, from which their bread was made, and barley, from which they brewed their beer. These two, bread and beer, were the very foundation of the Egyptian diet, the staples upon which everyone, from the poorest farmer to the Pharaoh himself, depended every single day. So central were they that grain served almost as a kind of money, and workers were often paid in measures of bread and jars of beer. But the Egyptian fields and gardens yielded far more than grain. Along the river and in their walled gardens, the people grew a rich abundance of vegetables and fruits, onions and garlic, leeks and lettuces, beans and lentils and chickpeas, cucumbers and melons. There were date palms and fig trees and pomegranates, and grapes for the wine that the wealthy loved. And the Nile itself teemed with fish, and its marshes with wild birds, so that the Egyptian table, even for ordinary people, could be varied and plentiful. The farmer's life was hard, governed by the sun and the seasons and the endless labor of the land, and made harder by the taxes he owed on his harvest, which were reckoned and collected by the scribes of the Pharaoh. And yet it was also a life of deep and ancient rhythm, lived close to the earth and the river, in a land of warmth and sunlight and abundance, sustained by the same great cycle of flood and growth and harvest that had sustained his ancestors for 100 generations before him. Let us leave the fields now and step into an Egyptian village to see how the people lived. The villages clustered along the edge of the Black Land, just above the reach of the flood, a huddle of houses of mud brick, their walls washed white or left the color of the earth, their flat roofs used as extra living space in the warm nights. Narrow, winding lanes ran between them, shaded from the fierce sun, alive with the sounds of daily life, the grinding of grain, the barking of dogs, the laughter of children, the chatter of neighbors. The Egyptians built their houses of mud brick, made from the very mud of the Nile, mixed with straw and dried in the sun. It was a humble material, and it did not last, which is why so little of everyday Egypt survives today, while the great stone temples and tombs, built to last forever, still stand. But mud brick was cheap and quick to build with, and wonderfully suited to the climate, keeping the houses cool in the heat of the day and warm in the cool of the night. The home of an ordinary family was simple. It might have only a few rooms, opening one into another, with small high windows to let in light and air while keeping out the worst of the heat and dust. The floors were of packed earth, the walls sometimes painted in cheerful colors. There was a main room where the family gathered, smaller rooms for sleeping and storage, and often a walled courtyard or a rooftop where much of daily life, especially the cooking, took place. The furniture of a common home was sparse and practical. People sat and slept on low stools and simple beds of wood, or on mats of woven reed spread upon the floor. There were chests and baskets for storing clothes and belongings, jars for grain and beer and water, and the tools of daily work. Only the wealthy owned fine furniture, elegant chairs, carved beds with headrests of wood or stone, chests inlaid with ivory and precious woods. For most people, life was lived simply, and with few possessions. At the heart of every home was the daily labor of preparing food, which fell mostly to the women of the household, and which was constant and hard. Grain had to be ground into flour day after day by kneeling and rubbing it between two stones, a task so laborious that the bones of Egyptian women often show its marks. From the flour, bread was baked, the staple of every meal, in dozens of shapes and kinds, sometimes sweetened with dates or honey, sometimes flavored with herbs. And alongside the bread came beer, the other great staple of the Egyptian diet. Egyptian beer was not much like our own. It was thick and only mildly alcoholic, more like a nourishing, soupy porridge than a modern drink, and it was consumed by everyone, men, women, and even children, as a basic food and a safe thing to drink. Made from barley bread left to ferment in water, it was rich in nutrients and formed with bread, the very foundation of what ordinary Egyptians ate and drank every day. Beyond bread and beer, the Egyptian diet was for many surprisingly varied and healthy. There were vegetables in abundance, onions and garlic eaten in great quantities, and lentils and beans and fresh greens. There was fruit, dates, figs, grapes, and melons. Fish from the Nile was a common food for ordinary people, dried and salted to keep. Meat from cattle, sheep, goats, pigs, and fowl was more of a luxury, eaten often by the rich, but only on special occasions by the poor. And everything was sweetened, when it could be, with the honey the Egyptians prized so highly. Now let us turn to the family, which was the very center of Egyptian life, cherished and celebrated above almost all things. The Egyptians loved family life dearly, and their art is full of tender scenes of husbands and wives sitting together, of parents with their children, of family affection openly and warmly shown. To have a happy home and many children was, for the Egyptian, one of the greatest of all blessings and the deepest wish of most ordinary people. Marriage in ancient Egypt was, for most, a simple and practical matter, without the elaborate ceremonies we might expect. There seems to have been no grand wedding ritual, no temple service. A couple was considered married, it appears, simply when they began to live together and set up a household. Yet marriage was taken seriously and was expected to be a lasting partnership, built, the Egyptians hoped, upon genuine love and affection, as their touching love poems so beautifully reveal. And here we come to one of the most remarkable features of ancient Egyptian life, the position of women, which was far higher and freer than in almost any other ancient civilization. Egyptian women could own property and buy and sell it. They could make contracts, bring lawsuits, and appear in court in their own right. They could inherit and leave inheritances. In the eyes of the law, a woman was, to a remarkable degree, the equal of a man, with rights that women in many later societies would not enjoy for thousands of years. A woman's main sphere, to be sure, was the home, and her chief role was as wife and mother, managing the household and raising the children. But she was mistress of her own home, and her role was honored and respected. Some women worked outside the home as well, as weavers, musicians, dancers, mourners, and priestesses, and a few rose to positions of real power and influence. And at the very summit, on rare and famous occasions, a woman even ruled all of Egypt as Pharaoh. Children were adored in ancient Egypt and longed for and welcomed with joy. A large family was a sign of the gods' favor and a comfort in old age, and childlessness was a real sorrow. Egyptian parents doted on their little ones, and the children in their earliest years seem to have run about the villages happy and mostly naked in the warm climate, their heads often shaved except for a single lock of hair, playing with simple toys, balls, dolls, carved animals, and games of all kinds. As they grew, children learned by helping their parents, girls at their mothers' sides in the work of the home, boys following their fathers into the fields or the workshop, learning the trade they would likely follow all their lives. For most, there was no formal schooling. The skills of life were passed down within the family, from parent to child, as they had been for countless generations. But for a fortunate few, especially boys, another path was open, one that could change a life entirely, the path of the scribe. In a land where almost no one could read or write, the scribe, the man who could, held a position of enormous privilege and power. Writing was the key to administration, to record keeping, to law, to religion, to almost every kind of authority. And so the scribe was exempt from the back-breaking labor of the fields, from taxes, and from military service, and could rise to high office and great respect. To become a scribe was, for a boy of humble birth, the surest path to a better life. And so, in the scribble schools, boys, usually the sons of scribes and officials, but sometimes bright boys of humbler families, learned the difficult art of writing. It was long, hard work, for the Egyptian script, the hieroglyphs, and its faster everyday form were fiendishly complex, with hundreds of signs to be learned by heart. The pupils practiced endlessly, copying texts over and over onto flakes of stone and broken pottery, under the strict discipline of their masters, who believed firmly that a boy's ears, as they said, were on his back, and he listened when he was beaten. The texts the young scribes copied often praised the scribe's life above all others, and warned, in vivid and sometimes comical detail, of the miseries of every other trade. The farmer struggles in the mud, the soldier is beaten and starved, the potter grubs in the clay, the fisherman labors among the crocodiles. But the scribe, these texts declared, is his own master, directs others, and never toils with his hands. Be a scribe, the boys were told, and set your heart upon books, for there is nothing better in all the world. The Egyptians wrote upon papyrus, one of their most famous inventions, made from the papyrus reed that grew thickly in the marshes of the Nile. The reed's inner pith was cut into strips, laid crosswise, pressed, and dried into smooth sheets that could be joined into long rolls, providing a light, durable writing surface that the Egyptians used for thousands of years, and that they exported across the ancient world. Upon it, they wrote with reed pens and ink of black and red, in flowing script. Beyond the scribes, Egyptian society was rich with skilled craftsmen and workers of every kind, whose labor filled the land with goods both humble and magnificent. There were potters shaping vessels on their wheels, and carpenters working the precious wood that was scarce in Egypt, and metalworkers casting tools and weapons and ornaments of copper, bronze, and gold. There were leather workers, and basket makers, and rope makers, and brewers and bakers, each with their trade, often passed down through families for generations. Among the most skilled were the weavers, for linen, made from the flax that grew in the fields, was the cloth of Egypt, and Egyptian linen was famous throughout the ancient world for its fineness. The finest of it, worn by the wealthy, was so sheer and delicate it was almost transparent, woven with astonishing skill upon simple looms. From this linen came nearly all Egyptian clothing, cool and light, and well suited to the hot climate. And there were the great artists and craftsmen who created the treasures for which Egypt is remembered. The sculptors who carved statues of stone, the painters who adorned the tombs with vivid scenes, the jewelers who worked gold and silver and gleaming stones into exquisite ornaments. These master craftsmen were highly valued, and the finest of them worked directly for the pharaoh and the temples, creating the wonders that still fill the museums of the world today. All of these people, from the humblest farmer to the highest official, fitted into a society that the Egyptians imagined as a great and stable order, ordained by the gods, in which everyone had their place. We might picture it as a pyramid, fittingly enough. At the very top stood the pharaoh, god and king. Below him, a small class of nobles, officials, and priests governed the land. Below them, the scribes and skilled craftsmen. And at the broad base, the vast majority, the farmers and laborers who worked the land and fed them all. At the very bottom were servants and slaves, though slavery in Egypt was not as central or as harsh as in some other ancient lands. Many who served did so as bound laborers or servants rather than as chattel, and even slaves had some rights and could sometimes win their freedom. Much of the hardest labor was done not by slaves at all, but by ordinary Egyptian peasants, working off their obligations to the state, especially during the flood season when the fields lay idle. What held this whole order together in the Egyptian mind was a profound idea they called Maat, the principle of truth, justice, balance, and cosmic order. Maat was the right way of things, the harmony that the gods had established at the creation, and it was the sacred duty of everyone, from the pharaoh down to the humblest person, to uphold it, to live justly and truthfully, and so to keep chaos at bay and the world in its proper order. Maat lay at the very heart of how the Egyptians understood their lives and their world. It was a remarkably stable order, and this is one of the most astonishing things about ancient Egypt, how very long it endured. Egyptian civilization lasted, in recognizable form, for some 3,000 years, longer than the time that separates us today from its own final days. Kingdoms rose and fell, and there were times of trouble and division, but through it all, the essential pattern of Egyptian life, its beliefs, its arts, its daily rhythms, endured with extraordinary continuity, age after age, along the unchanging river. Let us turn now to how the Egyptians looked and cared for their appearance, for they were a remarkably clean and elegant people who took great pride in how they presented themselves. In the heat of Egypt, clothing was light and simple, made almost entirely of white linen. Men wore kilts wrapped about the waist, women wore straight, close-fitting dresses, and children, in the warmth, often wore nothing at all. Fashions changed slowly over the centuries, but the cool simplicity of white linen remained the constant of Egyptian dress. The Egyptians loved cleanliness and bathed often in the river or with water poured over the body, and rubbed themselves with scented oils to protect and soften the skin in the dry heat. Cleanliness was tied to godliness in their minds, and the priests, especially, kept themselves scrupulously clean, shaving their entire bodies and bathing several times a day before approaching the gods. Both men and women delighted in cosmetics and adornment. Most striking of all was their eye paint, the famous dark makeup they applied around their eyes in bold lines, made from ground minerals, green from malachite and black from galena. It was not only for beauty, though it was certainly that. It also, they believed, protected the eyes from the harsh sun and from disease, and indeed it may genuinely have helped. That dramatic, dark-rimmed Egyptian eye is one of the most famous looks in all of history. The wealthy wore wigs, elaborate creations of human hair, styled and perfumed, worn over their own hair, which was often kept short or shaved beneath for coolness and cleanliness. They adorned themselves with jewelry, necklaces and collars of beads, bracelets, rings and earrings, made of gold and silver and gleaming semi-precious stones for the rich, and of humbler faience and pottery for the poor. For rich and poor alike, a favorite touch at feasts was a cone of scented fat worn upon the head, which melted slowly in the warmth, releasing its perfume. Now let us lift our eyes from the village and the workshop to the very summit of Egyptian society. The Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, who stood at the apex of it all. The Pharaoh was no ordinary ruler. He was regarded as a living god, the earthly embodiment of the divine, the link between the gods and humankind, upon whom the order and prosperity of all Egypt depended. It was his sacred duty to uphold Maat, to keep the cosmic order, to ensure the flood came and the land was fruitful, and to protect Egypt from the forces of chaos. The pharaoh's life was one of immense ceremony and duty, surrounded by ritual from waking to sleeping. He lived in a great palace, a sprawling complex of halls and courtyards and gardens, attended by a host of servants, officials, and courtiers. Yet for all his divine status, he was also a man who ate and slept and worried over the business of governing, who had a family he sometimes loved, and who bore the crushing weight of responsibility for the welfare of an entire kingdom and its gods. Governing Egypt was an enormous task, and the pharaoh ruled through a vast machinery of officials, headed by his chief minister, the vizier, who oversaw the whole administration of the land. Beneath the vizier stretched an army of officials and scribes, governing the provinces, collecting the taxes, managing the granaries, administering justice, and keeping the endless records upon which the smooth running of the kingdom depended. It was one of the most sophisticated and enduring systems of government in the ancient world. And now we come to the most famous achievement of all, the great monuments, the pyramids and temples and tombs, whose building shaped the lives of so many ordinary Egyptians. For centuries it was imagined that these were raised by armies of miserable slaves, driven by the whip. But we now know this was not so. The pyramid builders were, for the most part, skilled workers and ordinary Egyptian laborers, organized, housed, and fed by the state, who took real pride in their monumental work. We know a great deal about these workers because of a remarkable place, the village of Deir el-Medina, home to the craftsmen who built the royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings. This was a special community of skilled artisans, and because they were literate, they left behind an extraordinary record of their daily lives on thousands of scraps of pottery and stone, giving us an intimate glimpse into the ordinary world of ancient Egypt as almost nowhere else. From these records, we learn the small human details of their lives. We know their working week, and that they lived at the worksite during the week and returned to their families on their days off. We know they were paid in grain and goods, and that when their pay was once delayed, they staged what may be the first recorded strike in all of history, laying down their tools until they were paid. We know of their quarrels and lawsuits, their loves and debts, their sick days, and even the excuses they gave for missing work. Across the vast gulf of time, they come alive as real and recognizable people. Religion was woven through every moment of Egyptian daily life, far beyond the great temples and the state gods. Ordinary people had their own beloved household gods, more approachable than the grand deities of the temples. Chief among them was Bes, a cheerful, grotesque little dwarf god who protected the home, and especially mothers and children, and Taweret, a goddess in the form of a pregnant hippopotamus, who watched over women in childbirth. Their images were kept in homes across the land, guardians of ordinary family life. People carried amulets for protection and good fortune, small charms in the shape of gods, or sacred symbols like the Ankh, the sign of life, or the Eye of Horus, worn by the living and placed with the dead. They said prayers and made small offerings at household shrines, and turned to magic and charms to ward off dangers, illnesses, and the bites of snakes and scorpions. For the Egyptian, the divine was not distant, but present everywhere, in the home, in the fields, in every part of daily life. The great temples, though the common people could not usually enter their inner sanctuaries, still shaped the rhythm of the year through their many festivals. On these festival days, the images of the gods were carried out from the temples in grand processions, and the whole community celebrated with feasting, music, dancing, and often a generous supply of beer. These festivals were among the great joys of ordinary life, days of release and celebration that broke the round of daily labor and brought the whole community together. The Egyptians were also, for their time, remarkably advanced in medicine, and their doctors were famous throughout the ancient world. Egyptian physicians studied the body, set broken bones, treated wounds, and prescribed a vast array of remedies drawn from plants, minerals, and animals. Their medical texts describe hundreds of conditions and treatments with careful observation. Much of their medicine was mixed with magic and spells, for they saw illness as having both natural and supernatural causes. But much of it, too, was based on genuine practical knowledge, gathered over centuries. For all their labor, the Egyptians knew well how to enjoy themselves, and their lives were filled with music, dance, games, and celebration. Music was everywhere, at feasts and festivals, at work and at worship. They played harps and lutes and lyres, flutes and pipes and rattles and drums, and clapped and sang. Their art is full of musicians and dancers, especially graceful women. performing at the banquets of the wealthy, filling the warm evenings with melody and movement. The rich love to hold great banquets, and their tomb paintings show us these gatherings in loving detail. Guests in their finest linen and wigs and jewels, seated on chairs or cushions, served by attendants with an abundance of food and wine, entertained by musicians, dancers and acrobats, and wearing those little cones of scented fat upon their heads. The Egyptians clearly loved good food, good drink, good company, and good music, and knew how to make an evening merry. They loved games, too. The favorite was a board game called Senet, played by rich and poor alike across the whole span of Egyptian history, in which players moved their pieces across a board of 30 squares, according to the throw of casting sticks. It was more than a mere pastime. It took on a religious meaning, seen as a symbolic journey of the soul through the afterlife, and fine Senet boards were placed in tombs so the dead could play on into eternity. Out of doors, the Egyptians delighted in sport and recreation. They swam in the river and rowed and fished, both for food and for pleasure. The nobles loved to hunt, pursuing wildfowl in the marshes with throwing sticks and desert game with bows, and the bravest hunted the fearsome hippopotamus and even the lion. Children and adults alike played ball games and wrestled, and there were tug-of-war and juggling and all manner of physical games, enjoyed under the bright Egyptian sun. The Egyptians shared their world with a great many animals, both wild and tame, and their relationship with them was close, and in the case of some, deeply affectionate. On the farm they kept cattle, prized above all, along with sheep, goats, pigs, donkeys, and geese and ducks and other fowl. The donkey was the great beast of burden, and cattle were a measure of wealth. These animals were part of the daily fabric of life, tended, valued, and depended upon. But the animal most beloved of the Egyptians, and most associated with them ever since, was the cat. The Egyptians adored cats, which they first valued for protecting their precious grain stores from mice and rats, and for killing snakes, but which they came to cherish as treasured household companions. Cats were so esteemed that they were linked with the gods, especially the gentle goddess Bastet, and to harm or kill a cat was a terrible crime. When a family's cat died, it was mourned deeply and often carefully embalmed. Dogs, too, were kept as hunting companions, guards, and pets, and were given names and clearly loved. And beyond the home and farm, many kinds of animals were held sacred and associated with particular gods. The falcon with Horus, the ibis with Thoth, the jackal with Anubis, the crocodile with Sobek, the cow with Hathor. In the later ages of Egypt, vast numbers of these sacred animals were bred and mummified and offered to the gods. So deep did the connection between the animal world and the divine run in the Egyptian mind. Let us turn now to how the Egyptians traded and got the goods they needed, for theirs was a world without money as we know it. For most of their history, the Egyptians had no coins. Instead, they traded by barter, exchanging goods directly, one for another, with values reckoned against standard measures of grain or weights of metal. A worker was paid in bread, beer, grain, cloth, and oil, and took what he did not need to the market to exchange for other things. The market was a lively place, held often along the riverbank where boats could load and unload. Here people brought their surplus, farmers with grain and vegetables, fishermen with their catch, craftsmen with their wares, and haggled and exchanged. A sandal for a jar of oil, a basket of grain for a length of cloth. It was a bustling, sociable scene, full of the noise of bargaining, one of the great gathering places of ordinary daily life. And binding the whole land together, the great highway of all this trade and travel was the Nile itself. In a country that was one long, thin ribbon along a river, the easiest way to travel and to move goods was almost always by water. The Nile was Egypt's road, its main street, thronged with boats of every size, from little skiffs of bundled papyrus reed to great wooden cargo ships and elegant royal barges. And the river offered a wonderful convenience. It flows from south to north, while the wind, for most of the year, blows from north to south. So a boat could drift downstream with the current toward the sea, and then simply raise a sail to be carried back upstream against it. This gentle, reliable pattern made travel along the Nile easy and constant, and knit the long, narrow land together into a single kingdom, its villages and cities, all strung like beads along the flowing thread of the river. Along that river lay the cities of Egypt, though most Egyptians lived in villages, and the cities were smaller than we might imagine. Greatest among them at various times were Memphis, the ancient capital near the apex of the Nile Delta, a vast and cosmopolitan city, and Thebes in the south, the great religious capital, home to the stupendous temples of Karnak and Luxor, and across the river to the Valley of the Kings where the Pharaohs were buried. These cities were the beating hearts of Egyptian power, religion, and trade. No account of Egyptian daily life would be complete without speaking of death, for no people in history prepared for it so carefully or thought about it so much. But we must understand this rightly. The Egyptians were not a morbid or gloomy people, obsessed with dying. Quite the opposite. They loved life so deeply and found their world so good that they longed for it to continue forever, and their elaborate preparations for death were, in truth, preparations for an eternal continuation of the life they cherished. The Egyptians believed that a person was made up of several parts, not only the body, but also a life force, and a soul, and a name, and a shadow, all of which had to be preserved and cared for if a person was to live on after death. Above all, the body itself had to be preserved, for the soul would need it as a home in the afterlife. And this belief gave rise to their most famous practice of all, the art of mummification. Mummification was a long and careful process, carried out by skilled embalmers over some 70 days. The internal organs were removed and preserved separately. The body was dried out completely with a natural salt called natron, and then it was anointed with oils and resins, and wrapped, layer upon layer, in hundreds of yards of linen bandages, with protective amulets tucked between the wrappings. The result was a body preserved against decay, ready to house the soul for eternity, and many of these mummies survive, remarkably, to this very day. The finest and most elaborate mummification was costly, reserved for the wealthy, but simpler forms were available to those of more modest means, and even the poor were buried with what care their families could afford, often simply in the dry desert sand, which naturally preserved the body. The wish for a proper burial, and for the preservation that would allow life to continue, was shared by rich and poor alike, one of the deepest and most universal longings of Egyptian life. The tomb was thought of as a house for eternity, a home for the dead in the afterlife, and was prepared with as much care as any dwelling of the living, or more. The tombs of the wealthy were furnished with everything the dead might need: food and drink, furniture, clothing, jewelry, tools, and games. Their walls were painted with vivid scenes of the deceased and their family, of daily life, of farming and feasting and hunting, so that these good things might magically continue for them forever. It is, in a way, a beautiful irony that so much of what we know about Egyptian daily life, about how they farmed and cooked and dressed and played, comes from these images and objects placed in tombs to serve the dead in eternity. In seeking to carry their daily life with them beyond the grave, the Egyptians preserved it, unknowingly for us, so that across 4,000 years, we can look upon the small, warm details of their ordinary days, as fresh and vivid as when they were painted. The dead, the Egyptians believed, faced a journey and a judgment in the afterlife, culminating in the famous weighing of the heart, in which the heart of the deceased was weighed against the feather of truth, of Maat, to determine whether they had lived a good and just life. Those who passed this test entered a paradise called the Field of Reeds, a perfect, eternal Egypt, where they would live on forever in peace and plenty. And so, for the Egyptian, a good life lived in accordance with Maat was, quite literally, the key to eternity. Let us return now to the world of the living and to how order was kept in Egyptian society. For even in a land devoted to Maat, there was crime and disputes and the need for justice. Egyptian law was based upon that same great principle of Maat, of truth and fairness, and its administration was taken seriously. Local officials and councils of respected men heard disputes and judged cases, from quarrels over property to accusations of theft and worse. The Egyptians were, it seems, a rather litigious people, fond of taking their disputes to be judged, and the records of Deir el-Medina are full of lawsuits over debts, property, and inheritance. Punishments for crime could be harsh, including beatings, forced labor, and for the gravest offenses, death. Yet the ideal always was justice and balance, the restoration of Maat, and officials were sternly reminded of their duty to judge fairly, to show no favor to the rich, and to protect the weak from the strong. Egypt was also protected, and its power projected by its army, and the life of the soldier was another path an ordinary Egyptian man might follow. For much of Egyptian history, the army was raised as needed from the population, but in time a professional soldiery grew up. The scribbled texts, as we have heard, painted a grim picture of army life, all hardship and hunger and beatings, to steer boys toward the scribe's desk instead. Yet for some, the army offered adventure, advancement, and a share of the spoils of victory. Beyond its borders, Egypt reached out to distant lands in search of the goods it lacked, and this trade and these expeditions were part of the wider Egyptian world. From the south, from Nubia, came gold, ivory, ebony, and exotic animals. From the fabled land of Punt, reached by long sea voyages, came incense, myrrh, and precious goods. From the forests of Lebanon came the tall cedar wood that Egypt, poor in timber, so needed. Expeditions were sent to mine turquoise and copper in the deserts, and to quarry the fine stone for the great monuments. Now let us slow down and simply live through a single day in an ancient Egyptian village, from dawn to nightfall, drifting through its hours as gently as the river drifts to the sea. For there is a deep peace to be found in picturing the quiet rhythm of an ordinary day, so long ago and so far away, and yet so simple and so human that we can almost feel the warmth of that ancient sun upon our own faces. The day begins before dawn, in the cool grey light, with the first stirrings of the household. In the east, beyond the desert cliffs, the sky begins to pale, and then to glow with rose and gold, and at last the sun itself, Ra, the great god, rises over the land, and the whole valley is bathed in warm light. To the Egyptian, this daily sunrise was a small miracle, the victory of light over darkness, of life over death, renewed each and every morning. In the house, the family rises from their sleeping mats. A simple breakfast is taken, bread, perhaps with onions or fruit, and a drink of mild beer. The woman of the house kneels to begin the endless grinding of grain for the day's bread, while the man makes ready for his work, and the children wake and tumble out into the cool of the early morning. The village comes to life around them, doors opening, voices calling, animals lowing, smoke rising from the first fires into the still air. As the sun climbs, the men go out to their labor. The farmer walks out to his fields along the river to tend his crops or to labor at the great communal tasks of the irrigation channels that carry the precious water to the land. The craftsman goes to his workshop, the fisherman to his boat, the scribe to his office, and the women turn to the great work of the household, the grinding and baking, the brewing, the spinning and weaving, the fetching of water, the care of the little ones. Let us follow the farmer out into the fields in the growing season, where much of Egyptian life was lived. The green shoots rise from the dark earth. The channels glint with water. The great shaddafs, those simple lever devices for lifting water, dip and rise along the banks as men raise water from the river to the higher fields. Cattle graze. Birds wheel overhead. And beyond the green, always, the golden desert shimmers in the heat. It is a scene of patient, ancient labor, unchanged across the ages. Nearby lie the marshes, the thickets of tall papyrus and reeds along the water's edge, one of the richest and most beloved places in the Egyptian world. Here the water teems with fish, and the reeds are alive with birds of every kind, ducks and geese and herons and ibises. Fishermen pole their light skiffs of bundled reed among the papyrus, casting nets and spearing fish. And here the nobles came to hunt wildfowl for sport, gliding through the reeds, a scene painted in countless tombs, an image of the good life and its simple joys. The marshes were also a place of beauty and delight. Among the papyrus bloomed the lotus, the blue water lily, whose flower opened with the sun each morning and closed at dusk, and which the Egyptians loved above all flowers, as a symbol of rebirth and of the sun itself. Its sweet scent perfumed their feasts, its image adorned their art and their columns, and to hold a lotus to the nose was one of the small, gentle pleasures of Egyptian life, shown again and again in their paintings. By midday, the sun stands high and fierce, and the pace of life slows. In the heat of the day, people seek the shade, rest, and take a simple meal. The fields grow quiet, the workshops still, even the animals drowse. It is a time of stillness, of waiting out the worst of the heat before the work resumes in the cooler hours of the afternoon. The great river flows on, glittering, patient, indifferent as it has for 10,000 years. As the afternoon wears on and the heat softens, life stirs again. The work of the day is finished, the tasks completed, and as the sun begins its long descent toward the western hills, the people turn toward home. This westward journey of the sun each evening was, to the Egyptian, deeply meaningful, for the west was the land of the dead, and the setting sun was thought to die each night, to journey through the underworld, and to be reborn in the east at dawn. And so evening comes, the loveliest time of the Egyptian day. The light turns golden, then amber, then deep rose, and the river shines like molten copper beneath the darkening sky. Families gather in their homes or upon their rooftops in the cooling air. The evening meal is shared, the day's news exchanged, the children settled, and perhaps in a wealthy house, there is music and wine, and in a humble one, simply the quiet contentment of rest after labor together at the end of the day. Then night falls, swift and deep, and the enormous desert sky blazes with stars, more than we can ever see in our modern world of lights. The Egyptians knew those stars well, and read the heavens with care, and saw in them their gods and their eternal home. The village grows quiet, the fires burn low, the family lies down upon their mats to sleep, beneath the same great wheeling stars that had watched over their ancestors and would watch over their children's children for 1,000 years to come. Such was the shape of an ordinary day, repeated with the turning of the seasons across a whole life. And an Egyptian life, too, had its seasons. It began, as we have seen, in a childhood of play and gradual learning, cherished and indulged. Then came the passage into adulthood, and the taking up of one's trade, and for most, marriage and the founding of a household and the raising of the next generation, usually while still quite young by our standards. Middle life was the long season of labor and family, of raising children and working one's trade and tending one's parents in their age. And for those who lived long enough, for many died young by our standards, there came old age, which the Egyptians honored, hoping to reach what they considered the ideal span of 110 years, though few indeed came near it. The old were respected for their wisdom and experience, and cared for by their children, as they themselves had cared for their own parents. Through all these seasons of life, the Egyptian was sustained by a deep and abiding sense that the world was good, that it was ordered and just, and that death itself was not an ending, but a doorway to an eternal continuation of the life they loved. It was, for all its hardships, a fundamentally hopeful and life-affirming way of seeing the world, and perhaps this, as much as the gift of the Nile, was the secret of the extraordinary endurance and serenity of their civilization. Let us linger a while longer over some of the small, homely details of that daily life, for it is in these that a vanished world comes most warmly alive. Consider bread, the very staff of Egyptian life. It was made and baked fresh every day, in a great variety of shapes, round loaves and long ones, flat cakes and cones, some plain, some enriched with fat or dates or honey. The dough was baked in molds, or on hot stones, or in clay ovens, and the smell of baking bread must have filled every village each morning, as it has filled human settlements ever since. And consider beer, brewed in nearly every home. Loaves of lightly baked barley bread were crumbled into water and left to ferment in large jars, then strained, producing a thick, nourishing, mildly alcoholic drink that was safer than much of the water and rich in goodness. So essential was it that a common Egyptian greeting wished a person bread and beer, meaning all the necessities of a good life, and offerings of bread and beer were made to the gods and to the dead for their sustenance in eternity. Step now into a craftsman's workshop and watch the patient making of things by hand, for in a world without machines, every object was shaped by human skill. Here a carpenter joins wood with wondrous skill, lacking iron nails, using instead pegs and joints and glue to make fine furniture and coffins and boats. There a potter throws clay upon a simple wheel or shapes it by hand and fires it in a kiln. A weaver passes the shuttle back and forth upon the loom, the linen growing thread by thread beneath patient fingers. In the workshops of the jewelers and metalworkers, the finest treasures took shape. Gold, which the Egyptians had in abundance from the deserts and the south, was beaten into sheets and drawn into wire and worked into ornaments of breathtaking beauty. Craftsmen set gemstones and colored glass and glazed faience into collars and amulets and rings. They worked with such skill and such love of beauty and color that their creations still dazzle us across the span of 4,000 years. The Egyptians also loved words and stories and were among the first people in the world to create a true literature. They wrote tales of adventure and magic, of shipwrecked sailors on enchanted islands, of princes and their fates, of gods and their deeds. They wrote poems, including tender love poems, in which young lovers sigh for one another in words that still touch the heart across the millennia. And they wrote hymns to their gods, and to the Nile, and to the sun, of real beauty and feeling. They wrote, too, wise sayings and instructions, in which fathers passed on to their sons the wisdom of a good life. Be humble, be honest, control your temper, respect your parents, care for the poor, do not be greedy, listen more than you speak. This wisdom literature, thousands of years old, is full of advice so sensible and so humane that it could be given today. A reminder that, beneath the strangeness of their world, the Egyptians were people much like ourselves, seeking to live well. And they had humor, too, and a love of the comical, which peeks out at us from their art. Sketches and drawings, often on scraps of stone, that poke fun at the world, showing animals behaving like people, a cat serving a mouse, a lion and an antelope playing a board game, and cheerful little caricatures. Behind the solemn, formal art of the temples and tombs, there was a lively, playful, very human sense of fun. Let us picture, too, the gardens that the Egyptians so dearly loved, for a garden was, to them, one of the greatest of pleasures. The wealthy laid out beautiful walled gardens around their homes, with a rectangular pool at the center, cool and shaded, where fish swam and lotus and papyrus grew. Around it stood carefully tended trees, date palms and sycamore figs and pomegranates, giving shade and fruit, and beds of bright flowers, cornflowers and poppies and mandrakes. In the fierce heat of Egypt, such a garden, green and cool and fragrant, with its shady trees and its still pool reflecting the sky, was a little paradise, a place to sit in the cool of the evening, to relax with family and friends, to enjoy the birdsong and the scent of flowers. So beloved were these gardens that the Egyptians imagined their heaven, the field of reeds, as a kind of perfect, eternal garden, and hoped to sit beneath their sycamore trees by their cool pools forever. Music and dance deserve a fuller word, for they filled Egyptian life with joy. There were work songs to lighten labor in the fields, and songs at every celebration. Skilled musicians, many of them women, played in ensembles at the banquets of the great, and troops of graceful dancers, often young women, performed acrobatic and elegant dances to the music of harps and lutes and flutes and rhythmic clapping. Music accompanied the temple rituals and the great festivals, and simple songs surely accompanied the humblest tasks of daily life. Let us imagine now one of the great festival days, for these were the high points of the Egyptian year, eagerly awaited by all. Imagine the whole community gathering as the god's shrine is carried forth from the temple upon a sacred boat, borne on the shoulders of the priests, glittering and veiled. The crowds line the way, music sounds, incense drifts upon the air, and the people rejoice, for on this day the god comes forth among them, and the ordinary round of labor gives way to celebration. On such days there was feasting, and free-flowing beer and wine, and dancing in the streets, and a joyful release from the cares of daily life. Some festivals lasted for many days. Some, like the great festival at Thebes, when the god Ammon journeyed to visit another temple, drew people from all around in a vast and joyful throng. These were the times ordinary Egyptians looked forward to through the long months of labor, the bright threads woven through the fabric of their working year. Picture the great temples themselves at the heart of these festivals, for they were among the wonders of the world. To approach the temple of Karnak at Thebes was to pass through towering gateways, down avenues lined with sphinxes, into vast courtyards and halls where forests of gigantic stone columns, painted in brilliant colors, rose so high they seemed to hold up the very sky. These were not places of public worship as we know it, but the houses of the gods, tended by the priests, are awesome and sacred and hidden. The ordinary person could not enter the inner sanctuary, where the priests alone served the god. But they could come to the outer areas to pray, to leave offerings, to seek healing or advice, and to consult the god through oracles, asking questions and receiving answers as the sacred boat was carried in procession. The temple was the dwelling of the divine among them, the anchor of their world, vast and eternal, a promise in stone that the gods watched over Egypt. Beyond the green valley and its cities and temples lay always the desert, the red land, vast and silent and deadly, and it too was part of the Egyptian world. It was a place of danger and death, the realm of chaos and of the god set, where few could survive. Yet it was also a place of refuge and of resources. It held the tombs and the mines, the quarries and the routes to distant lands, and its very harshness was the wall that protected Egypt for millennia from the invaders who could not cross it. And in the desert dwelt the creatures of the wild, and along the river's edge the dangerous ones the Egyptians knew well and feared. The crocodile, lurking in the shallows, worshipped as the god Sobek, yet dreaded by every fisherman and washerwoman. And the hippopotamus, huge and unpredictable, a danger to boats and to those who work the marshes. To live along the Nile was to live alongside these powerful animals, woven into both the daily perils and the sacred imagination of the people. Now we might pause to wonder, how do we know all of this? How can we speak so intimately of the daily life of people who lived 3, 4, even 5,000 years ago? The answer lies in the extraordinary gifts of Egypt's dry climate and its people's care for eternity, which together have preserved the ancient world as almost nowhere else on earth, waiting patiently through the ages to be found. The dry desert sand and the sealed tombs preserved things that would have crumbled to dust anywhere else. Not only stone temples and mummies, but wooden furniture, baskets, clothing, food, flowers, papyrus documents, children's toys, and the painted scenes that show us daily life in vivid detail. In the tombs meant to serve the dead, and in the rubbish heaps and abandoned villages of the living, the ordinary world of ancient Egypt lay preserved, waiting across the millennia. For a long time, though, this world was silent because its writing could not be read. For centuries after the last hieroglyphs were carved, no one on earth could understand them, and ancient Egypt was a realm of mystery, its inscriptions a beautiful but meaningless puzzle. The key was lost, and with it, it seemed, the voice of a whole civilization. Then, a little over 200 years ago, came the discovery that unlocked it all. The Rosetta Stone, a slab carved with the same message in 3 scripts, including hieroglyphs and Greek. By comparing the known Greek with the unknown hieroglyphs, scholars, above all a brilliant Frenchman named Champollion, at last cracked the code, and the ancient script gave up its secrets. Suddenly, the Egyptians could speak again, across thousands of years, and their letters, their records, their stories, and their prayers could be read once more. And so, through the patient work of archaeologists and scholars, and through the marvels preserved in the dry earth, the daily life of ancient Egypt has been recovered in astonishing richness, so that we can know these long-dead people not as remote and alien figures, but as living, breathing human beings, with their work and their loves, their meals and their games, their hopes and their fears, much like our own. And when we consider it all, one thing above all astonishes: the sheer immense span of it. Ancient Egyptian civilization endured for some 3,000 years. To an Egyptian living near its end, the pyramids were already more ancient than the pyramids are to us today. Kingdoms rose and fell, and languages and rulers changed, and yet the essential daily life of the people along the river, the farming and the festivals, the bread and the beer, the love of family and the hope of eternity, flowed on with the Nile, generation after generation, for longer than almost any other way of life in human history. Let us return once more to the small textures of that life, and dwell a while on the world of the Egyptian woman at the heart of the home. Her day was one of constant, varied work, rising early to grind grain and bake the day's bread, brewing beer, fetching water from the river or the well, spinning thread and weaving cloth, tending the cooking fire, caring for the children, and keeping the household in order. It was hard, unending labor, and yet it was her own domain, and within it, she held real authority and respect. Yet a woman's life was not all toil. There were the pleasures of family and friendship, the gathering of women at the river or the well, the shared work and shared talk that has bound communities together in every age. There were the festivals and celebrations, the music and dancing. There was the adorning of oneself with linen and jewelry and cosmetics. And there was the deep joy, so treasured by the Egyptians, of children and family and a well-loved home. The birth of a child was a moment of great joy, and of danger too, for childbirth was perilous in the ancient world. Egyptian women gave birth attended by midwives and female relatives, calling upon the protective household gods, Bes and Taweret, and upon charms and spells to keep mother and child safe. A safe birth was cause for celebration and thanksgiving, and the new baby was welcomed into the family with love and with hope. Babies were nursed and carried close, often in a sling upon the mother's body as she went about her work, and were cherished tenderly. Children were given names full of meaning, often invoking the gods or expressing the parents' love and hopes, names that meant things like beloved or beautiful or gift of a god. And so a new life began its journey into the same warm, ancient world of river and sun and family that had welcomed its ancestors for 1,000 generations. The Egyptians measured their days and their year with real skill, and were among the first to divide the day into hours, using the movement of the sun by day and the stars by night. They built simple sundials and water clocks to mark the passing hours, and their priests watched the heavens closely, for the stars governed the calendar and the festivals. Their year of 365 days, close to our own, was one of their great achievements and forms a root of the calendar we still use today. The rising of one star above all was of supreme importance. Sirius, the brightest star in the sky, whose reappearance in the dawn, after being hidden for weeks, coincided with the beginning of the Nile's annual flood. This heavenly sign, marking the start of the new year and the life-giving inundation, tied together for the Egyptians the movements of the stars, the flooding of the river, and the whole sacred rhythm of their lives, earth and heaven bound as one. Consider, too, the many trades that filled the Egyptian day. The builder hauling and setting mud brick or dressing great stones. The herdsman driving his cattle to pasture and guarding them through the night. The fisherman out on the river before dawn. The washerman beating linen clean at the water's edge, ever watchful for crocodiles. The baker and the brewer, the barber and the sandal maker, the boatman and the porter, each with their labor, together weaving the rich, busy fabric of daily life along the Nile. And binding all these people together were the bonds of community, of neighborhood and village, of shared work and shared celebration, of mutual help in times of need. The records of Deir el-Medina show us neighbors lending and borrowing, quarreling and reconciling, gossiping and helping one another, standing witness at one another's affairs, and joining together in the festivals and the funerals that marked the great moments of life. It was, for all its differences, a human community much like any other, then or now. Imagine an evening in such a village at the end of the day's labor. The families gather in the cooling air. Neighbors call to one another across the lanes. Somewhere, someone is playing a flute. Somewhere, children are laughing. Somewhere, the smell of baking bread drifts on the breeze. The great red sun sinks toward the desert, and the river turns to gold, and a whole community settles together into the peace of the evening as their ancestors had done, and their descendants would do for age upon age. Let us picture, for one last vivid scene, a great feast in the house of a wealthy noble. For the tomb paintings show us these gatherings so clearly that we can almost step into them. The guests arrive in their finest pleated linen, their eyes painted, their wigs perfumed, and are welcomed with garlands of flowers about their necks and lotus blooms to hold. Servants move among them, offering wine and every kind of delicacy, and the little cones of scented fat glisten upon their heads in the lamplight. The food is abundant and fine. Roast fowl and joints of beef, fresh bread and cakes sweetened with honey and dates, figs and grapes and pomegranates, and wine poured freely from great jars. Musicians play upon harps and lutes and flutes. Graceful dancers move to the rhythm, and the guests eat and drink and talk long into the warm night, savoring the good things of a life they loved so well that they hope to enjoy such feasts forever in the world to come. And yet the Egyptians, even at their feasts, kept a gentle awareness of life's passing. At some banquets, it is said, a small figure of a mummy was carried among the guests with the words, "Look upon this and drink and be merry, for when you die, such will you be." It was not a morbid thought to them, but a tender one, a reminder to savor the sweetness of life while it lasted, precisely because it was precious and would not last forever. "Eat, drink, and be joyful," they said, "for life is short, and the world is good." When we step back and consider this whole vanished world, what strikes us most, perhaps, is how deeply the ancient Egyptians shaped the world we still live in. Ours is a civilization that inherited so much from them, often without knowing it. Our year of 365 days, our division of the day into hours, our use of paper descended from their papyrus, and even our very word for paper, all reach back to Egypt. More than these particular gifts, though, Egypt gave the world an enduring example of what human beings can achieve. In monumental art and architecture, in medicine and mathematics, in writing and record keeping, in the organization of a great and stable state, the Egyptians were pioneers, and later civilizations, Greek and Roman and beyond, looked back to them with wonder and drew deeply from their wisdom, as we still do today. But perhaps the deepest legacy of ancient Egypt is simply the enduring fascination it holds for us, the sense of connection we feel when we gaze upon a painted tomb, or a child's toy, or a loaf of bread 4,000 years old, and recognize, across that vast gulf of time, our shared humanity. These were people who loved their families, who worked and rested, who laughed and grieved, who delighted in beauty and feared the dark, and who hoped, above all, that life and love might somehow endure beyond the grave. And in a sense, their deepest wish came true. For the ancient Egyptians believed that a person lived on as long as their name was spoken and remembered. And here we are, thousands of years later, on the far side of the world, speaking of them still, picturing their days, remembering their lives. In some small way tonight, we have kept their memory alive and given these long-departed people, for a little while, the eternity they so dearly longed for. Let us take a gentle journey, now, in our imagination, down the length of the Nile itself, from the far south to the sea, drifting slowly with the current as an ancient traveler might have, past the whole living tapestry of Egypt. We begin in the deep south, at the first cataract, where the river tumbles over rocks and the land is harsh and hot, the frontier of Egypt, where great temples stood guard and boats were loaded with the gold and ivory of Nubia beyond. From there the river flows north, and we drift with it, past Thebes with its mighty temples, past the towns and villages strung along the green banks, past endless fields where farmers bend to their work, past herds drinking at the water's edge, past fishermen in their reed boats and children playing in the shallows. On either hand rise the desert cliffs, golden in the sun, and between them the river winds, broad and calm and life-giving, the shining thread that holds the whole land together. This long, narrow valley of the south, the Egyptians called Upper Egypt, upper because it lay upstream, toward the river's source. And as we drift northward, at last the cliffs draw back, and the land opens out, and we come to where the river divides into many branches and spreads across a broad, flat, incredibly fertile plain before reaching the sea. This was Lower Egypt, the delta, downstream, a green world of marshes and rich fields and winding waterways. The two lands, Upper and Lower Egypt, the narrow valley and the broad delta, were different in character, and the Egyptians never forgot that their kingdom was, in origin, a union of the two. Their pharaoh wore the double crown, joining the white crown of the south and the red crown of the north, and bore the title Lord of the two lands, a memory, kept for 3,000 years, of the ancient uniting of the valley and the delta into a single, enduring kingdom. The delta, with its lush marshes, was a paradise for wildlife and a rich land for farming and herding, its papyrus thickets alive with birds, its pastures fat with cattle. And at its edge lay the sea, and the harbors through which Egypt met the wider world, trading with the lands of the Mediterranean, receiving foreign goods and foreign peoples, so that the northern cities grew cosmopolitan and busy, mingling the folk of many lands upon the ancient soil of Egypt. Let us turn now to matters of the heart. For the Egyptians, as their poetry shows, knew love as tenderly as any people who ever lived. Their love poems, written thousands of years ago, are full of longing and delight. A young man calls his beloved his sister in the fond language of love and sighs that his heart races when he sees her. A girl wishes she were his servant, that she might always be near him. Lovers pine at being parted and rejoice at being together. Across 4,000 years, the language of young love is instantly, touchingly familiar. Courtship and the choosing of a partner seem often to have been matters of genuine affection, though families surely played their part, and marriages were also practical arrangements for building a household and a family. However it began, the Egyptian ideal of marriage was a warm and loving companionship, and the wisdom texts urged husbands to love and cherish their wives, to make their homes happy, and to be faithful and kind, that they might grow old together in contentment. When a couple married, there was, as we have heard, no grand ceremony, but there was surely celebration, a feast with family and friends, as the bride went to live in her husband's home, or the couple set up a household of their own. They would often draw up a contract, especially to protect the woman's property and her rights should the marriage end, for divorce was possible in Egypt, and a divorced or widowed woman kept her own property and could marry again. The Egyptians lived, too, in a world alive with magic and the supernatural, woven inseparably into their daily lives. They believed deeply in the power of spells and charms, of magic words and protective amulets, to heal the sick, to ward off danger, to bring love or good fortune, and to protect against the many unseen perils of the world. Magic, to them, was not opposed to religion or to medicine, but part of the same great effort to keep chaos at bay and to live safely in a world full of hidden powers. They set great store by dreams, believing them to be messages, glimpses of the future or the will of the gods, and they kept dream books that explained what different dreams might mean, much as some people do today. And they marked certain days of the calendar as lucky or unlucky, believing that on some days one should undertake nothing important, while others were favorable. On an unlucky day, a careful Egyptian might stay quietly at home, avoid the river, and take no risks, waiting for a more fortunate time. They guarded themselves and their children with amulets of every kind worn about the neck or wrist. The protective eye of Horus, the ankh of life, the scarab beetle, symbol of the sun's rebirth, the little figures of the household gods. These small charms of gold or faience or humble clay were among the most common of all Egyptian objects, and they speak to us of ordinary people's deep, human longing for safety, for their loved ones, and for good fortune in an uncertain world. Let us return one last time to that remarkable village of Deir el-Medina, home of the tomb builders, and live a little in its world, for through it we can see ordinary Egyptian life more closely than almost anywhere. The workmen would set out to the royal tombs, laboring through the working days, then return to their families in the village on their rest days. They worked in gangs, with foremen and scribes to organize them, and were paid in rations of grain, fish, vegetables, and other goods delivered by the state. From the thousands of notes they left, we know these people almost as neighbors. We know a foreman named Painab, accused by his enemies of all manner of misdeeds. We know of workmen who missed work to brew beer, to tend a sick relative, or simply because they had been drinking. We know of their debts and their loans, their gifts and their grudges. We know a scribe who kept careful records, and a man who wrote love letters, and women who ran their households while the men were away at the tombs. They are astonishingly, movingly real. Their records even preserve real disputes and crimes, giving us a rare glimpse into Egyptian justice at work. There were quarrels over unpaid debts and disputed property, accusations of theft, and on occasion, darker matters. Cases were heard by a local court of respected villagers who questioned the parties and witnesses and gave their judgment. Sometimes the god himself was consulted, his oracle giving a verdict as his image was carried in procession. It was justice on a human scale, among people who all knew one another. Let us not forget the children, and their games and toys, for childhood delight is one of the sweetest threads of any human world. Egyptian children played with balls of leather stuffed with straw or reeds, with spinning tops, with dolls of wood and cloth, some with movable limbs or hair of beads. They had carved animals, some with jaws or tails that moved when a string was pulled, a little wooden crocodile that opened its mouth, a cat, a horse on wheels, and they played the games children have always played: leapfrog, tug-of-war, ball games, and running and jumping in the sun. And in many homes there were pets, loved then as now. Cats, of course, curled in the warmth, half wild and half tame, guardians of the grain and companions of the hearth. Dogs of several breeds, given names and cherished, some shown in tomb paintings sitting faithfully beneath their master's chair. Monkeys and geese were kept, and pet birds, and the wealthy kept exotic creatures in their gardens. The bond between the Egyptians and their animals was old and deep and full of affection. Consider, too, how much care the Egyptians gave to keeping clean and well, in ways that seem strikingly modern. They washed frequently, used a paste to clean their teeth, and made deodorants and breath fresheners. They shaved with razors of bronze and dressed their hair and wigs with care. They made cosmetics and perfumes and creams to protect the skin. For people living in heat and dust, this daily attention to cleanliness and grooming was both practical and, clearly, a real pleasure and a point of pride. Egypt's cities, especially in the Delta and at the great capitals, were home to people from many lands, for Egypt drew traders, workers, and settlers from all around. There were Nubians from the south, Libyans from the western deserts, and peoples from the lands of the eastern Mediterranean, living and working alongside the Egyptians, especially in the cosmopolitan north. Egypt, for all the protection of its deserts, was never truly closed, but met and mingled with the wider world along its edges and in its cities. And through every hour of the day, the gods were present, close and familiar. A woman in labor called upon Taweret. A household kept an image of cheerful Bes. A traveler prayed to be kept safe upon the road. A farmer gave thanks for the flood. A sick child was treated with a spell in the name of a healing god. The great gods of the temples were remote, but these smaller, kindlier household gods were friends, protectors of the ordinary and the everyday, woven into every joy and fear of daily life. When at last a life came to its end, the community gathered for the funeral, which was both a solemn ritual and a final act of love. The body, prepared by the embalmers, was carried in procession to the tomb, the family and mourners following, sometimes with professional mourning women who wept and wailed to honor the dead. Priests performed the sacred rites, above all the ceremony that was believed to restore the dead person's senses for the afterlife, and offerings of food and drink were made. Then the beloved dead was laid to rest in the tomb with the goods they would need, and the entrance was sealed, and the family returned to the world of the living to remember and to bring offerings and to speak the name of the one who had gone, keeping their memory and so their life alive. For to be remembered was to the Egyptian to live on, and love, they believed, could reach even across the threshold of death, binding the living and the dead together in one unbroken family forever. Across the 3,000 years of Egyptian history, ordinary daily life went on beneath the reigns of many pharaohs, some of whom we still remember by name, and it is worth pausing to picture the great sweep of that history, upon which so many quiet lives were lived. In the earliest age, the pharaohs of the Old Kingdom raised the greatest of all the pyramids, and to build them, tens of thousands of ordinary Egyptians labored, season after season, in one of the most astonishing feats in all of human history. Picture the building of a great pyramid, the vast workforce, housed and fed in their own town nearby, the quarrymen cutting the huge stone blocks, the haulers dragging them on sledges over ramps of earth and rubble, the surveyors and architects ensuring every angle was true. It was the labor of decades, organized with extraordinary skill, and the workers, we now know, were not slaves, but Egyptians serving their king and their gods, proud of their work, well fed, and even cared for by doctors when they were hurt. When a pyramid or a great tomb was finished, it must have seemed, to those who built it, a thing beyond the power of ordinary men, a mountain raised by human hands to touch the heavens and to carry their God-King into eternity. And there they still stand, 4,500 years later, the last surviving wonder of the ancient world, monuments not only to the pharaohs who ordered them, but to the countless ordinary Egyptians whose sweat and skill actually raised them, stone by stone, into the desert sky. In later ages came other famous rulers, whose names still echo. There was the woman Hatshepsut, one of the few female pharaohs, who ruled ably for many years and sent great trading expeditions to distant lands. There was Akhenaten, the strange king who tried to sweep away the old gods and worship the sun alone, turning Egyptian life upside down for a generation before the old ways returned. And there was his son, a boy king named Tutankhamun, unimportant in his own time, but destined for immortal fame when his tomb was found, thousands of years later, its treasures miraculously intact. There was Rameses the Great, who ruled for an astonishing 67 years, raised colossal monuments across the land, and fathered a vast brood of children, becoming the very image of the mighty Pharaoh. And at the very end, long after, came Cleopatra, the last pharaoh of all, after whom Egypt passed under the rule of Rome, and the 3,000-year line of the pharaohs came to its close. Through all their reigns, the ordinary people farmed and fished and baked and prayed, their daily lives flowing on beneath the changing kings, like the river beneath the changing sky. Let us look, too, at the daily life of the priests who served in the great temples, for theirs was a world apart. A priest's chief duty was to care for the god, whose image dwelt in the temples in a sanctuary. Each day, in solemn ritual, the priests would purify themselves, enter the shrine, and tend the god as one might a living king, waking it, washing and anointing and clothing its image, offering it food and drink, and singing its praises before sealing the shrine once more. Many priests did not serve full-time, but took turns, serving in the temple for a period, and then returning to their ordinary lives and occupations, so that priesthood was woven into the wider society. In return for their service, and for the great estates they held, the temples grew immensely wealthy and powerful, owning vast lands and herds and armies of workers, becoming great centers not only of religion, but of learning, economy, and administration, pillars of the Egyptian world. And let us picture once more the boats upon the river, for the boat was central to Egyptian life and imagination. They built vessels of all kinds, from small skiffs of bundled papyrus, light enough to carry, to great wooden ships that bore heavy cargoes of stone and grain up and down the Nile. Boat building was a fine craft, and the river was forever busy with sails, the boatmen calling to one another, poling and rowing and steering with long oars in the endless traffic of the great waterway. So central was the boat that the Egyptians imagined the sun god himself sailing across the sky by day and through the underworld by night in a great celestial boat. Kings were buried with magnificent boats to carry them through eternity, and the journey of the soul to the afterlife was pictured as a voyage by water. In life and in death, in this world and the next, the Egyptian imagination flowed always along the river, the great highway that was the very axis of their world. And over all of it arched the Egyptian sky, and the Egyptian weather, mild and dry and sun-filled for most of the year. Rain almost never fell in the valley, the sun shone nearly every day, and the greatest change was the coming of the flood and the shift of the 3 seasons. In such a climate, life was lived much out of doors, in courtyards and on rooftops, and in the fields under a sky that was, for most of the year, a clear and brilliant blue by day and a deep, star-filled black by night. Let us linger a little longer over the simple pleasures of the Egyptian kitchen, for food was, then as now, one of the great joys of daily life. Cooking was done over open fires and in clay ovens, usually in the courtyard or on the rooftop, in the open air. Bread was baked, stews of beans and lentils and vegetables were simmered in pots, fish was grilled or dried, and on special days, fowl or meat was roasted, filling the air with savory smells that must have drawn hungry children to the hearth. They flavored their food with herbs and spices, with onions and garlic in abundance, with salt, and with the honey they loved for sweetness. They pressed oil from seeds for cooking and made a great variety of cakes and pastries. And they preserved food against leaner times, drying and salting fish and meat, storing grain in granaries, and keeping fruits and other foods, so that the bounty of the good seasons could carry them through the year. Picture a simple family meal in the cool of the evening. The family sits together on mats or low stools around the shared dishes, for they ate with their fingers from common bowls, washing their hands before and after. There is fresh bread, still warm, a bowl of stewed vegetables or beans, perhaps some fish, or on a good day a little meat, onions and greens, dates or figs to finish, and jars of mild beer. It is a humble meal, but a nourishing one, shared in the warmth of family, at the end of a day of honest work. The whole of this life turned, as we have seen, with the great wheel of the 3 seasons, and to live an Egyptian year was to feel that wheel turning. In the flood season, the waters rose and the fields vanished beneath the shining lake, and the pace of farming ceased, and many went to labor on the king's works or mended their tools and rested. It was a strange, suspended time, the familiar land transformed into water, the villages like islands, the boats gliding where crops had grown. Then the waters withdrew, leaving the fresh black mud, and the season of growing began, the busy time of ploughing and sowing and tending, of watching the green shoots rise and the crops swell under the gentle winter sun. And then the harvest, the golden, urgent time of gathering in the grain, of threshing and winnowing and filling the granaries, before the sun grew fierce and the river began once more to rise. Round and round the great wheel turned, year upon year, the heartbeat of Egyptian life. And through all the seasons, the crafts of Egypt went on, each with its own quiet rhythm. Picture the potter at his wheel, the wet clay rising and shaping beneath his hands, then set to dry and fired in the kiln. Picture the weaver at the loom, the shuttle passing to and fro, the cloth growing slowly, thread by patient thread. Picture the carpenter, the metal worker, the leather worker, the basket maker, each bent to their ancient craft, making by hand the countless things a living world requires. There is a deep peace in imagining these patient labors, unhurried, skilled, repeated across the generations. In a world without machines, everything was made slowly, by human hands, with care and knowledge passed from parent to child. A bowl, a basket, a length of cloth, a wooden stool, each held within it the time and the skill of a human being, and the long inheritance of a craft older than memory. It was a slower world, and in its slowness, perhaps, there was a kind of quiet that our own faster age has lost. Imagine walking through such a village in the late afternoon as the day's work winds down. Down the shaded, dusty lanes, past the whitewashed houses, you would hear the sounds of that patient life. The rhythmic grinding of grain, the soft thud of the potter's work, the creak of a loom, the murmur of voices, a snatch of song, the laughter of children, the bleating of a goat. Ordinary sounds, human sounds, drifting on the warm air, the music of a world going peacefully about its daily round. And above it all, always, the great sky, and the great river, and the great sun, the unchanging companions of Egyptian life. The sun that rose each morning over the eastern cliffs and set each evening beyond the western desert. The river that flowed on, steady and life-giving, through it all. And the deep blue sky and the brilliant stars of the desert night. Beneath these vast and constant presences, the small, warm human lives were lived and passed and were remembered generation upon generation for 3,000 years. It is that in the end that stays with us, not the pharaohs and their monuments, grand as they are, but the ordinary people and the gentle, enduring rhythm of their days. Their world is gone now, vanished into the deep past, its language long silent, its gods no longer worshipped, its way of life ended thousands of years ago. And yet, through what they left behind, and through the care with which they prepared for an eternity they so deeply desired, we can still reach out and touch it and feel, across the ages, the warmth of that ancient sun. So let this long, gentle journey into the world of ancient Egypt settle over you now, softly, like the warm dusk settling over the valley of the Nile. There is nothing more that you need to remember tonight, and nowhere else that you need to be. We have wandered together through their fields and their villages, their homes and their workshops, their feasts and their festivals, from the rising of the sun to the coming of the stars, and now it is time simply to rest. Let your breathing slow and soften and settle like the great river easing at last toward the sea. Let the images drift away, gently. The golden fields, the white houses, the cool green gardens, the painted temples, the boats upon the shining water, all sinking softly into the deep, calm current of the past. There is nothing to hold and nothing to do, only the quiet and the warmth and the deep and patient rest that has closed in its time over every day and every age, even the brightest. Drift now, easily and without fear, down into sleep, carried gently upon the flowing river of time, while the great sun sinks behind the western hills, and the stars come out over the sleeping land, and the Nile flows on through the darkness, as it has for 10,000 years, and as it always will, quiet and steady and eternal, until the gentle coming of the morning. Sleep well. Rest deeply, and may your own night be as peaceful as the calm, star-filled nights of that ancient and beloved land.